I just started reading again a couple of years ago, and I never really got into classics. So I'm starting a segment to read classics and give my modern opinion on them. What I'm finding is that being older when I read these is kind of affecting my opinion on them. I read Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre with a book club on Fable, and a lot of people's opinions were very different from mine. And I want to say that part of that is because they either read it when they were young or they're older than me and have a different outlook on feminism and what they consider independent women. So let's get into my opinion of Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. My opinion of the book is that I didn't really like it. There was good pieces to it. I did see some of the independence of a woman in the 1800s, and that was really great that she had her own mind. She had her own opinions. It was also really interesting to see how life was in the 1800s since she wrote it in 1840 or it published in 1847. So it was really interesting to see what society was like, the hierarchies, how they treated other people, and just what people were like back then, especially the way they talked. I mean, it was absolutely insane. I can't believe they spoke the way they spoke in this book, and maybe they didn't, but it, there were pages of lyrical conversations. The rest of this video is going to have some spoilers. So, firstly, this book starts off with 10 chapters of just straight up child abuse. And it almost becomes sadistic. I really almost DNF'd it if it was going to continue the way it was because it was just constant. And on the one hand, I understand that some of this is influenced by Charlotte's actual life, but by the end of the book, I still don't exactly see what the point of all of 10 chapters, long chapters worth of her childhood. It was a little important, but not this long. Then let's talk about the fact that this is supposed to be a romance. And I just did not like Mr. Rochester. Let's talk about some things that he did and said to Jane. And for some reason, she still fell in love with him. The very first meeting that he has with her, he calls her elfish and a witch and multiple other things. And maybe this is just his personality. Maybe he's just kind of being sarcastic and funny, but it doesn't exactly come out that way. He's insisting that she is otherworldly in kind of a bad way. If you think of fairies back in the 1800s, they weren't, Tinkerbells. They were not nice. I don't think that he's complimenting her when he says these things. It is one of the things that he's prone to for some reason, but it doesn't come off very nice. The next thing is, and it's a recurring theme in this book, not just for Mr. Rochester, but people just point out all the time how plain or unattractive people are, and he specifically tells her that she's unattractive. On the other hand of that, she also tells him that he's not very attractive. So it's just maybe one of those things in the 1800s that people were just blunt about. It's, for my modern brain, not very nice. He calls her, and I quote, a simpleton. And he also calls her naive and without experience. And he says this a lot. And while it's true, he doesn't need to continually point it out. There is a part of the book where he has friends visit, and one of them is someone at this point of the book we think he might end up marrying. And this lady, Miss Ingram, insults the living hell out of Jane. And he just listens. He doesn't say a damn word. In opposition, he doesn't say anything at all. While she pretty much says that governesses are stupid and worthless and shouldn't be here, basically. And then after this, where he does not stand up for her, when she leaves the room, he follows her and tells her that he expects her to come back every single night. And my question is why? You didn't talk to her. She was being insulted and you didn't stand up for her. And she doesn't like these people. So, and then also, why are you demanding? I know you're her boss at this point, but you really have to demand that she comes every night to your party where she doesn't really know or like anybody and they don't really know or like her. Also during this time, again, we think he's courting Miss Ingram, and he will continually have conversations with Jane where it starts out like he's flirting with her and then ends with, oh, but my future bride. And it's really manipulative and weird. We find out later in the book that he's just testing her. This whole time, he's number one, leaning on Miss Ingram, which we are made not to feel bad about because she is just courting him for his money, and he makes sure of that because he has a rumor go back to her that he's not actually rich, and he sees that she gets disappointed and doesn't want to marry him anymore. But at the same time, he is leading her on and lying to her as well. Again, he's doing his manipulative thing, and that night he proposes to Jane after talking again about his future bride and still testing her at this point. The day she gets proposed to, he's still testing her. It is not romantic at all. So he tests her, and he tells her he's purposely making her jealous so that she would love him. Again, that is manipulative. Then we find out he lies to her the whole time. Okay, she goes to marry him. They are at the altar, and some other man comes up and says, no, you can't marry her. You already have a wife. But so he wanted his cake and to eat it too. Of course, this lady he was married to was a lunatic and not in her right mind, and this time he couldn't divorce her. But he was still going to make Jane his mistress, and she would have thought she was married to him. Later, after she comes out and is talking to him about the situation, this is a quote from their conversation. Jane, will you hear reason? He stooped and approached his lips to my ear. Because if you won't, I'll try violence. And I'm supposed to believe that this is a love story? No, it's not. If this was promoted more as a tale of caution or something, or how easily you can fall for someone who's manipulative, I don't know. It would have sat better with me. But the fact that this is marketed as a romance, I just cannot accept that. Also, before they get married, for some reason, Jane doesn't want to be treated as a lover. She insists that he doesn't buy her things. She insists that he doesn't treat her nicely. They eventually get to a point where they're almost like a brother and sister relationship, where he's like flicking her ear or still calling her witch or elfish and saying these kind of things. She insists that he doesn't compliment her, and I find that so strange. Then after the whole conversation about his wife, she decides that she needs to leave. Obviously, if she stays, she's in love with him. She's not going to be able to resist him. So she leaves without her full salary, and she just goes in the middle of the night and gets into this cab. I'm going to call it, it's not a cab, and goes off to a different city. And she runs out of money, and she's living outside for a couple days. And it just really grinds my gears that she did nothing wrong. He was lying to her the whole time, and she's the one suffering for it. All this to say that Jane lived her life knowing like two men before she met Rochester, one being her cousin who was abusive, and the other being I'm going to call him the principal of the school that she went to, and he was also, I'm going to call him abusive. He didn't want to feed his kids, whatever. This is the first man that she meets that's not just passing by, and he's not outright cruel to her. So is that why she falls in love with him? That's not a really good story to me. There's also some things that bother me about Jane. So she has no family for a lot of her life, and she just wants to be loved, it seems. But when she finally gets news of an uncle that wants to adopt her, she just goes back to Rochester and sends that guy a letter, and why didn't you go find him? And then later when he dies, she wishes that she was able to have a relationship with him. Well, that's your fault. Why didn't you go to him? And then in the later part of the book, she does meet cousins, and she does have a good relationship with them. But one of her cousins decides he wants to marry her, which at the time is fine, I guess. Um, but he just keeps insisting. And one thing that when I was having discussions on Fable, people were saying, hey, she's an independent woman. She said no to John, and she said no to Rochester when he wanted to make her his mistress. First off, she was losing herself to Rochester in the first place when she was going to marry him before she knew he had a wife. He was already making her wear clothes that he wanted her to wear. And that was just the start, right? He bought her a pearl necklace that she said she didn't want. So that was just the start. She was going to lose herself to him and not be independent anymore. Then let's talk about John, right? Everybody's saying, hey, she said no to him. And she did quite a few times, probably like 5 times, right? But in the end, she was saying yes to him, and some supernatural force that came out of nowhere is what made her stop, because she heard Rochester from miles away somehow, and I don't know how, but whatever. She was saying yes to him. She was saying yes to John at that point, and she admitted multiple times that if she would marry John, she would die in more ways than one. She would literally die, probably, but she would also lose herself completely. She wouldn't be herself, and she wasn't herself for weeks with John because she wanted to impress him. Since she admired him so much, she wanted him to like her. So even by that point, before she would have married him, she already was losing herself. And I just don't believe this story that she's independent. She was for a while. I loved her as governess, and I loved when she became a teacher, and I loved that she wanted to open a school. But here's some things I don't like about Jane. When she finally got to have a school, she didn't like that the students were uneducated. She didn't like that they were lowly and farmers. And that was really rude because she's been wanting people to treat her as an equal, Rochester specifically. And now she's being rude to these kids who just want to learn. And she finally got what she wanted, and now she doesn't want it anymore. She calls them unsophisticated and dull. The other thing I don't like about Jane is that when she goes to find Rochester after all this, she finds the house burnt to the ground. And the only person she thinks about is Rochester. She doesn't worry for a second, not once, in her mind, at least as far as she wrote. She doesn't wonder for a second where Adele is or where Mrs. Fairfax was, which were people that truly cared about her. And not for a second did she worry about their lives. And I really think that's telling for the kind of person she was. So I guess in the end, she did deserve Rochester because she wasn't a good person either. In the end, she does end up marrying Rochester, and at this point of the story, he is maimed. He has lost a hand, and he has lost an eye, and the other eye, he can't see out of, and it's because he was in the house when it burned down. And this is another point brought up by the Fable users, is that in the end, again, she is an independent woman. She's living the life she wants. But the only reason she's living the life that she wants and she hasn't lost herself to whatever man she's married to is because he's maimed. It's because he's disabled. She is taking care of him, and he cannot lead because he can't see. And I'm not saying that you can't lead if you can't see. Don't put those words in my mouth. But in the story, he needs to be literally led by her because he can't see, and she needs to read to him and all these things. And obviously he's not going to buy her dresses and jewelry when they're living in the country, when they're living in the country, and he can't even see any of that anyways. So she did end up getting the life that she wanted, but simply because Mr. Rochester wasn't fully himself anymore. So how is that a love story? My last thought is I don't understand that why the whole John storyline happened. It was like the end of the book, and they introduced like a whole, and she introduced a whole new storyline almost. And by the end of the book, I don't know what a lot of the story was there for. It didn't seem pertinent. It was really like a diary, which isn't terrible, but when you don't like the person writing the diary, it's not a fun read. I know this is a very controversial opinion, and I'm gonna get a lot of hate for it, and I welcome it. Please, in the comments, tell me your thoughts and if you agree or disagree. Thanks.